Hi, I'm Quentin Schultz, author of the book Communicating with Grace and Virtue. In this video, I'm talking a little bit about Chapter 6. There's so much material in Chapter 6, and I can only focus on a bit of it, but it's important what I want to talk with you today about because it's not talked about much, and our understanding of communication often is just not very good because of this problem. I'm going to be talking about virtue. Being virtuous communicators, which means essentially being communicators who come at communication as having good and right character, our character as human beings. When you say that person is a character, sometimes we just mean they're kind of a little bit nutty, but I'm talking about our deep character, our tendencies. Do we tend to be nice? Do we tend to be nasty? Do we tend to be listeners or non-listeners and so forth? So our tendencies, our character, much of it coming from our hearts. And I think it's important to think about communication, not just in terms of the effects of our communication on others, but also in terms of ourselves and our qualities of character. Here's an interesting aspect of this. I taught college for years, and at the beginning of each class, just a week or so before the class would begin, I would send out a survey to students, and I would ask them a number of questions to help me know more about them and to prep better. And I would say, what are the attributes or characteristics that you most liked about your previous professors? Anything that would help me, so I could be like that too. And they would always say kindness. Kindness. They loved kindness of one kind or another in their professors. They wouldn't talk so much about whether or not that professor is easy or hard, but just this kind of trait of kindness. And in fact, there is a gravity in our communication. You know what gravity is with the earth, right? Stuff goes down. Well, there's a kind of gravity in communication where we gravitate toward people we like and away from those we don't like. This is gravity in communication, and we all do it. People we like, we gravitate toward them. We want to spend time with them. We enjoy them more, and then we gravitate away from people that we don't like. And it affects all of us. We don't always think about it. It's not always too conscious. But if, let's say, we're going to go out for lunch and we're thinking about somebody to invite, we're going to invite someone generally that we like. And there's something going on here in terms of the character of these people. They are people of a kind of character that we really appreciate. And so we want to be around them. And of course, what happens is we become somewhat like them as well, the more we communicate with them in our relationships, in our communities together. So character is important, but we don't talk much about it with respect to communication, even though it itself affects us every day. So there's a difference then between talking about communication in terms of skill and virtue. Skill has to do with how well we seem to be able to communicate. How well can we get across to another person what we want to get across to them? Or if it's in terms of influence, how well can we get someone to do something that we would like them to do, or to believe something? So we have purposes behind our communication, and are we accomplishing those purposes? And we say if we are quote unquote skilled communicators. Well, that's different than virtue. Virtue is what we as human beings bring to our communication. It's the character, the qualities of us as a human being. Virtue means essentially good qualities of character. A virtuous person is a person who has good qualities of character. And when we become more like that, we automatically have some effects on other people. Chances are they're going to like us more. They're going to be around us more. They're going to trust us more. But we don't do character for that effect, because that destroys the very nature of virtue as something that comes from within us, from our hearts. We are people of virtue inside. The inside comes out. So these are two different ways of thinking about quote unquote good communication: to be skilled at it and effective, and to be virtuous about it because of our character, and thereby perhaps to be more effective, but not as a matter of skill per se. I wrote a book about public speaking, and I have a picture of the cover here. It's called An Essential Guide to Public Speaking. Recently updated that in a second edition, worked on it, and put a lot more material in it on being a virtuous public speaker. Because, of course, in public life today, there is such a mess. There are so many government people and leaders, political leaders, and so many people in business and in education, it turns out, and in the ministry, that are just getting into deep trouble because they have certain character defects. And they may hide some of their character defects for a while through their communication, but they're being disingenuous, dishonest in their communication. And so I agree with St. Augustine, who said essentially the purpose of public speaking is to love your audience as your neighbor. The purpose of public speaking is to love your audience as your neighbor. Now, we could carry this over to something else, like for me as a teacher, I would say the purpose of my teaching in part is to love my students as my neighbors. And what that gets at is love. It gets at a matter of what's in our hearts. Do we aim to use the gift of communication to love and serve others? Servant communicator. Or are we basically serving ourselves and maybe putting one over on people, even in public speaking? Now, this is really, really important. Yet today it's not considered. And a lot of the textbooks on public speaking just talk about the skill part. They don't talk about virtue at all. They disregard it. And so I wanted to get that back into a book on public speaking, get virtue back in there. What I call servant speaking, to be a servant speaker. And I think to the extent to which Christians, as an example, can be better servant speakers, they will also be more effective, but they won't be skilled for the purpose of lying and deceit and deception and the like, which you can also, with looking at just communication skill, you can be very skilled, but not a nice person. And you can be manipulating and using other people for personal gain. So I think it's a time in our history now, similar to Augustine around the year 400, where public speaking was not doing well. It was in dire straits from an ethical standpoint, in dire straits. And Augustine himself wondered in the beginning when he became a Christian and he was trained as a rhetorician, a public speaker, a manipulator, really, to put one over on people. He then became a Christian. He said, you can't be a real public speaker or a public rhetorician and a Christian too. They can't be put together. But then he changed his mind. And the reason he changed his mind is exactly what I'm talking about. To be faithful, especially to be a virtuous speaker, a speaker of good character. And he put that back on the map for many centuries in his own work on communication. And so what I'm trying to do in the book, Communicating with Grace and Virtue, is to help get that back on the map with our public speaking and with all of our communication as Christians. Because for us to be believed and trusted in society, in all communities, I think we need to be people of virtue, who communicate as people of virtue. So now, one way of looking at this is to think about it in terms of the fruit of the Spirit. And this is what I've done in part in this book. In fact, both of the books I'm talking about here. And we know what the fruit of the Spirit are: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Well, it's possible to say that each of these can influence from our hearts our communication. Are we, for example, a gentle speaker? Are we a self-controlled speaker? Do we speak and then get into trouble and we should have waited and been? Are we patient? Are we kind? And so on. It seems to me love is obvious. We should be loving communicators, and that's a virtue quality that should come out of us. Just as God loved us and we're filled up with gratitude, we become loving communicators of others. These other fruit of the Spirit, as gifts from God to us that we both pursue and are given at the same time, and we cultivate in us are not quite as obvious in terms of communication. So I just like to say a little bit about three of them that I think are essential qualities of character, virtues for Christians. One is to be kind, to be kind. And are we kind? Are we kind of nasty? Can we be rough in our communication in a way that hurts other people? To be kind, to think of other people as those that are like us and treat them like we would want to be treated with kindness. Second is gentleness, to be gentle people, not to be rough. Here's a funny story about this. I got a note from a longtime friend of mine about a video that I had posted on YouTube, and he looked at it and then he wrote me a note. He said, when you make those videos, you need to be more like Mr. Rogers, like Fred Rogers. He said, you need to come across with more gentleness. And he had a point. Out of my ambitiousness in part comes a kind of forcefulness that gets me into trouble with some of my communication. Gentleness is good. And finally, patience. One of the most important qualities of character for all of us as communicators, because without patience, we constantly get into communication trouble. Oh, it's awful, isn't it? We fire a text, we send an email, we say something in a conversation. Something comes to mind and we let it go, and it might not be nice, and we say, whoa, I'd like to take that back. I'd like to take that back, please. But we can't, it's out there. Patience is so important. I think particularly in the book of James, there's so much consideration of this, to be slow to speak and quick to listen because of this. We fire off without patience and we get into trouble. So I think that being a virtuous communicator is very, very important. And it's different from skill. We can be skilled and not such nice people and use that skill in ways that we shouldn't. But to be people of good character, it is invariably going to infect our communication positively. And we will be truly better, truly good communicators as people of virtue. The Holy Spirit wants to get us there. We open our heart and we pursue the fruit of the Spirit, and God blesses us with them. And it begins to settle into our souls, comes out through our hearts and our communication through any medium. It's a gift. It's a glorious gift. So be virtuous communicators, not just skilled communicators. Again, I'm Quentin Schultz, author of the book, Communicating with Grace and Virtue. Thank you for watching this. If you'd like to know more about me, sign up for my free email newsletter. It's at quentinschultz.com. Peace to you. Be virtuous, brothers and sisters.